Hello and welcome to the garden. So it's that time of year when I really need to get cracking with some sowing. So I need to prepare some seed sowing mix, and one of the ingredients I'm increasingly relying on here is coir. And I thought I'd do a quick video about the coir and why I'm using it and how it needs to be prepared, in case there are one or two folks out there who aren't that familiar with it. So I think most gardeners now are well aware of the move away from peat-based composts, and it wasn't a problem some years ago. I remember being able to get really very good organic peat-free multi-purpose. It wasn't expensive, it had a fairly nice texture. Of course there were a few chunky bits and bits of wood that hadn't properly decomposed, but it would sieve readily, and the result was a pretty nice sowing medium. It was quite successful for seed sowing, but it was also very good straight from the bag as a potting mix. The stuff I'm picking up now, frankly, it's awful. It's this fluffy, claggy stuff. I think it's pretty poor for seed sowing, so it's not exactly what I would call a multi-purpose. It certainly doesn't suit the purpose of raising young plants. I think it works better in large pots. I think you can get away with it there, but even so, I'm not that impressed with it. So coir is something that I am increasingly relying on to give a nice texture and a nice structure to my sowing mixes. So if you think about peat as a sowing mix, it really offers a plant very little. It's a fairly inert substance, has very low nutritional value. I mean, if you pick up a bag of peat-based or largely peat-based compost, if that is feeding your plants for weeks, it's not the peat. It's only because additional fertilizers have been added to that bag of compost. The peat itself really offers very little apart from a fairly pleasant medium for plants to root in. And because it's low in nutrition, it really is ideal for seed sowing, and that's one reason why it's really difficult to get rid of it from the entire horticultural industry, because it is so effective, and of course it's low cost. So to replace that, it's a little bit tricky. It's really tricky now when we get bags of half composted junk, and it's just really not suitable for starting young plants in. But coir is very similar. So this is how I get it, in these large bricks, and you can get half-size blocks as well. But these are really dead handy. I mean, when I've reconstituted this will be, they say, about 70 litres in volume, and it doesn't take up that much space. It's easy to stack a few of those up in the shed and store them out of the way. And this substance is quite similar in a way to peat. So it's a slightly processed husks of the coconut, and it's a waste product, and turning it into a sowing medium or a planting medium, that's a pretty good idea. I mean, this stuff appears of course in bagged composts already, but I've got the raw ingredient here, if you like, which I'm going to make up and mix with some sieved multi-purpose. All the junk is gone from it, and I'll add a bit of vermiculite, and that will make a really nice sowing medium. So this stuff has, I think, fairly similar properties to peat. It's fairly inert, it's low in nutrient, it doesn't have a lot of value to the plants, but that's exactly what you want for starting seed. You don't want to start seed in a rich medium. If you think about seed that they're designed to fall or be deposited by animals on the surface of the ground, they're going to be used to starting in sort of leaf litter, leaf mold that fairly low nutrient layer on the top of the soil, and they're not supposed to be started in really rich compost. It's not good for the root system. So Coir is, I think, a pretty good substitute for the peat. It holds a ton of moisture, and in order to sort of reconstitute this compressed dried brick, it's going to take a lot of water, and this will make a couple of trugs full of Coir. And the texture is quite nice. I mean, there's fibre in there. If I just pull a bit off, you can see on the camera that there's lots of fibre in it. So this is not something that you can sieve any sense to get that very fine texture that you would get from peat. But I've not found that the texture of this is in any way detrimental. Seedlings seem to prick out perfectly fine from a mix that has Coir in it. So I think in practice I rather like this stuff. So anyway, I mean, it's a little bit weird if you've never seen it or used it before, but it's pretty straightforward. All you have to do is drop this in a suitably large container and pour on a lot of water, and it will take a remarkable amount of water. And that's one of the really nice things with this. It holds so much moisture. You have to be a little bit careful, and a bit more careful than with some of the more traditional sowing mixes, not to overwater. It does tend to look a little dry on the surface whilst being still pretty damp underneath. So long as you're careful, and occasionally I will even knock a little seedling out of the pot just to get a sense of how much moisture there really is lower down, because the last thing you want is for your seedlings to be trying to root into soggy compost. They will not like that at all. But so long as you don't overwater it, it's a pretty good medium. It holds a lot of water, but at the same time there's plenty of air in the mix. It's a really nice light substance, and roots need air as well as water. So anyway, let me get this one started. So I've just dropped this brick into this good sized trug here. This is I'm going to need a second one, because this will make far too much rehydrated Coir for this one trug. But and it's going to want more water than that, but I'll let it get started on that, and I'm just going to leave it there to start hydrating. You can't break this stuff up any sense, not until it started to soak up some of that moisture. And now it's just a case of leaving it to soak, and then I'll come along and I will break up some of these larger chunks, and then I will get more of this going. I will need 2 of these tubs to contain all of that when it's rehydrated. Doesn't take too long. 15-20 minutes is probably enough to get this reasonably well processed. So I'll pop back in a few minutes. Might not be quite ready yet, but I'll have a little go, see if I can break up some of this now. Yeah, there we go. You can see it's pretty dry inside, but I can now break up some of this block here. And these smaller lumps are going to hydrate more quickly. This just speeds the process up a bit. Otherwise it would take a very long time to soak into the whole of this block. You really can't break these up any sense when they're dry, but when they start to soak up some moisture, it's a lot easier. So I'll get the second bucket on the go here. Like, might look a little bit swampy in there, but believe me, it needs more water yet. So I'll leave that another 5 or 10 minutes and come back to it. Now, I'm only doing this already because I'm a little bit impatient, so just break up a few of those bigger lumps. You can leave this just in a wheelbarrow and let it soak, and it will eventually rehydrate. But if you keep breaking it up into smaller and smaller bits, it's going to do that so much more quickly. Well, after another 5 or 10 minutes, you can sort of get in there and break up what's left. That one's not looking too bad now. Still some dry bits in there. This one is pretty dusty, actually. It probably needs more water. Yeah, that's bone dry. I don't want to go too far with it now. It's a bit soggy down the bottom, but there's still some dry stuff there. Just get in and break it and fluff it up. It's nearly there. Yeah, this is not bad. To give you an idea of just how much moisture this can hold, I mean this is damp, but it doesn't look too soggy. I mean, it's quite light and fluffy stuff now, but if I give that a squeeze, there's tons of liquid in that still. Oh, now it's now it's too dry, of course. So yeah, I mean, it gives you an idea of the moisture holding capability of this. And I first started using this in earnest because one of the composts I was using last year, it just wouldn't hold moisture and everything was drying out so quickly. But mixing it with this stuff, and it's got a fantastic ability to hold moisture. But at the same time, even though this is full of moisture, it's not clumping together, it's not really soggy, it's really holding that moisture sort of locked in. It's not turned into a sort of sumpy mess. So plants will still be quite happy with that. If I were sowing direct into this, and you can sow straight into coir, there's no problem with that. You can do that in the same way as people have been sowing into peat for years. And I mean, commercially, I know they use a lot of the little pellets, jiffy pellets and similar, where you can get coir pellets as well as peat pellets, and they do pretty much the same job. So you can sow directly into that right now. It's not a problem. If I were going to do that, I would probably leave this for a couple of days just to finish rehydrating any last remaining dry spots, and just for that sort of excess moisture to distribute itself properly or sink down to the bottom, so that it's not quite as wet as it is now. I think it's a lot easier to get this broken down if you use plenty of moisture, and I don't think there's too much in this at the moment, but there is quite a bit in there. So I could sow straight into this, but I can also adjust the texture of it with various additions. And when you're thinking about seeds and very young seedlings, actually it's all about texture, because at that point they need very little in terms of nutrition. So it's the texture that's so important. You don't want a compost that drains so quickly and dries out that you have to water it several times a day. You don't want a compost that holds so much water that the bottom of the pot or cell remains soggy, because roots will not penetrate into soggy compost. So there's all sorts of things like that. You don't want a compost that caps over with a sort of hard surface, because it's very difficult for young shoots to break out of. And you might then decide that you don't want to use this direct, even though you can. And things like a little bit of vermiculite or perlite, they may well help to improve the texture a little bit. And I will be adding a little bit of vermiculite to my mix. But I'm also going to add some sieved multipurpose. That's going to change the texture. But this coir is the component that's really going to help retain a useful amount of water and stop the compost from drying out. Other things you can add, a little bit of sandy loam, particularly if you were potting up smaller plants rather than sowing. Leaf mold if you've got it, or some homemade compost if it's good and clean. You don't want to be propagating your own weed seeds, but if you've got some good clean compost, then that would be a nice addition too. But again, you don't want anything too rich. So the material I'm adding here, it's pretty inert, so I'm not going to be overfeeding the young plants. But anyway, the texture of this is nice now. It's good and light. The second tub, well, that's got a bit further to go. It's still pretty dry, but I will allow that to hydrate over a bit of a longer period, because I'm not in such a hurry to get on with that. Now the multi-purpose, dear oh dear, that was bad. Oh. So while I was waiting for the coir to hydrate, I sieved out a bag of multi-purpose. It's a fairly coarse sieve. It's not too fine, so you don't want anything too fine. It takes too long to sieve it, and some of this compost just won't go through a fine sieve. Where's my scoop gone? So that's what I'm left with. It's a pretty fine texture. It's quite light. There are small bits of wood in here and bits of junk still, because you can't get rid of them, not with a sieve like that. This though is the collection of rubbish that I've taken out of it, and this is just horrible. I mean, it's just coarse, lumpy junk, chunks of wood. I think there's some, I don't know if this is coir or maybe it looks a little bit more like, it looks like sawdust, to be honest, but I couldn't say for sure what that was. But whatever it is, this is not compost. It hasn't been composted, and you can't use this stuff when you're sowing into modules or where you want to be pricking the seedlings out later. It just makes a complete mess of it. But yeah, that's not impressive, because that's a lot of junk out of one bag of compost. But anyway, time to make some mix up. So I'll start with some of this coir, and just because I've only just done it and in a bit of a hurry, I'll make sure that there are no lumps in it. That's not too bad. Right, I'll add a little bit of vermiculite. And then I'll add some of this sieved multi-purpose. I'll give that a bit of a mix up. I mix this as and when I need it, because I will adjust the sowing mix from time to time, somewhat on a whim, but also depending what I'm sowing. I might add some horticultural grit or some other material to it. You can see there are still bits of wood in this, but not so much now that it would cause any trouble to the sowing and growing of these young plants. So that's not bad, I think. It's got quite a nice light texture, plenty of air in there. I think it's the sort of medium that roots will get into pretty happily. I just need to be careful not to overwater that, because with the coir in there, and of course the vermiculite holds quite a bit of moisture, it is quite easy to overwater, and the top of this dries out and it looks like it's thirsty when it really isn't. So just a little bit of care is needed, sort of adapt to these newer materials. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good seed sowing mix now. So that's it for the coir, and whether you use it in a blend or on its own, I think this is a pretty useful medium, at least for the early stages, for sowing, for pricking out and potting on young seedlings. Later on with bigger plants, the texture's not quite so important, but it really is important at this early stage. And I think coir is a fairly useful ingredient. I'm certainly quite keen on it. The blocks are dead handy to stash away in the potting shed. They're a bit of a faff to prepare ready for use, although if you've got the time to just leave them to soak and get on with it for an hour or two, there's a lot less whacking required. I'm only breaking these up into smaller pieces to get the job done a little bit more quickly. That's not essential, but yeah, this is nice stuff now, and I'll be putting this to good use shortly. Anyway, that is all for this video. Thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.